Greetings, everyone. It's great to have you back for another spine-tingling journey into the world of true ghost stories. Tonight, I have a story that will send shivers down your spine, a tale of an old house hidden deep in the woods. A restless spirit, and the eerie events that forced a family to flee. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's step into the unknown together. Story 1. There's something unsettling about old houses. Especially the ones that stand alone in the middle of nowhere. Surrounded by thick forests where the wind whispers through the trees like a warning. My father, Samuel, and his wife, Bree, lived in such a house. It was a beautiful two-story home, built in the late 1920s. Tucked away in a quiet part of Willow Creek, the house sat on a sprawling piece of land, complete with an old pond that shimmered under the moonlight. It looked like the kind of place where a person could find peace and solitude. But as I would soon learn, it held secrets best left undisturbed. One Friday evening, I arrived at my dad's house for a weekend visit. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't something I could pinpoint. It was more like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. After dinner, as we sat in the dimly lit living room, my dad leaned in and said, "Something happened here yesterday. Something I can't explain." I tensed. My dad wasn't one for ghost stories. If he was bringing this up, I knew it had to be serious. I was upstairs playing a game on my computer. He began. It was quiet, just me and Phoebe. Phoebe was their golden retriever, a gentle and loving dog. Then, out of nowhere, she started barking at the front door. Dad had checked outside, but no one was there. The gravel road leading up to the house was empty. Yet, Phoebe continued barking, growling even, as if something stood just beyond the threshold. Something she could see but he couldn't. I ignored it and went back upstairs. Dad continued, and that's when I heard it. He paused, as if replaying the moment in his head. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. He turned around instantly, expecting to see Bree home early from work. But the stairs were empty. I jumped out of my chair. He said, looked around. No one. But I swear to you, I heard those steps. Someone was coming up the stairs. Chills crawled up my spine as I listened. I glanced at Phoebe, who lay by the fireplace, her ears twitching as if she was still on high alert. That night, as I lay in bed in the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that house. And the worst was yet to come. The following weekend, I invited my best friend, Tara, to come stay over. She was the kind of person who laughed in the face of horror movies and rolled her eyes at ghost stories. Naturally, I told her about what my dad had experienced, and she scoffed. "It's probably the house settling," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Old houses creak. You know." That night, we decided to watch a horror movie to set the mood, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was a mistake. By the time we turned off the TV, we were already feeling on edge. I suggested we go to bed, but as we climbed the stairs, something caught our attention. The outdoor faucet had turned on. Water was running. We exchanged uneasy glances before peeking out the window. The yard was empty, bathed in silver moonlight. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the water stopped. A minute passed. Then two. Click. The faucet turned on again. This time, Tara grabbed my wrist. "Whitney," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's no one out there." We stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the distant sound of water trickling into the dirt. Finally, I mustered the courage to run downstairs and shut it off. My hands trembled as I gripped the faucet handle. We locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sprinted back upstairs. As we reached the top step, another sound filled the house. Clack, clack, clack. The unmistakable sound of pool balls rolling across a wooden floor. The game room was directly above us. Tara turned to me, her face pale. "You don't have a pool table, do you?" "We do," I whispered, "and no one is up there." A loud thud echoed through the ceiling, as if someone had dropped a heavy ball. Then, silence. I reached for the doorknob to the game room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I pushed the door open. Nothing. The room was empty. But the pool balls had been arranged in a perfect triangle in the center of the table. Tara grabbed my arm. "I believe you now. We didn't sleep that night." The next morning, as daylight poured through the windows, we walked around the house to see if anything else was out of place. The picture frames on the walls, every single one, had been turned sideways. By the end of that month, my dad and Bree decided to move out. The house remained abandoned for years, its windows dark, its secrets locked away. No one knew what haunted those walls. But we all knew one thing. Some houses were never meant to be lived in. What makes a house haunted? Is it the echoes of past lives? The lingering energy of those who came before? Or is it something else entirely? Something waiting, watching, feeding off our fear? I often wonder what would have happened if my dad had stayed in that house longer. Would the occurrences have escalated? Would we have finally seen whatever left those footprints on the stairs? One thing is certain. Some houses don't want to be homes. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's story. If you have your own real-life ghost encounters, share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe. And keep your lights on at night. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. Story 2. I don't know how to begin this without sounding insane. But here we are. If you've ever experienced something that defies reason, you'll understand the feeling, the creeping sense that something is watching you. That something is just out of sight but never too far away. For years, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. That the house I grew up in was just old. That the sounds I heard were just the house settling. And that the things I saw were tricks of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I always knew the truth. Something was there, and it wasn't friendly. I grew up in a quiet town, in an old house that had been in our family for generations. My older siblings, Thomas and Caroline, had moved out by the time I was old enough to really understand the strange occurrences. That left me alone with my parents. And while I should have felt safe, I never did. The guest room at the end of the hall always scared me. Even during the day, it had a shadowy gloom that seemed unnatural. At night, it was far worse. I could never look at the open door without feeling an overwhelming dread. It felt like something inside was watching me, something that wanted me gone. Several rooms in the house made me uneasy. But the worst were the guest room, the basement, the bathroom that connected my bedroom to the guest room, and my parents' closet. These spaces had a presence, an almost tangible sense of being occupied by something unseen. I had nightmares about these rooms constantly, and sometimes, it felt as though they were speaking to me in my sleep. I always insisted on keeping the bathroom door closed when I was in my room. Ever since that night, I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, playing quietly with my toys. when I noticed something in the bathroom doorway. It wasn't a figure. Exactly, it was a shadow. Long and distorted, as if something unseen was standing just out of sight. Its presence bending the light in an impossible way. I knew my parents were downstairs watching television. I knew no one else was home. But that shadow was there. And it was watching me. I ran downstairs crying, terrified beyond words. My parents, of course, dismissed it. "You have such a wild imagination." My mother sighed. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. It was the first time I truly understood that whatever was in that house, I was facing it alone. The nightmares never stopped. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of something growling, low and guttural. Not quite animal but not entirely human either. Shadows danced along the walls of my room in ways they shouldn't. Sometimes, I would see a face, a hollow, angry face, glaring at me from the darkness. For years, I dealt with the strange occurrences alone. My brother, Thomas, had mentioned once that he saw something weird in the guest room. Back when it was still Caroline's room. But he never wanted to talk about it. And my parents shut down any conversation about ghosts or spirits. So I kept it to myself, trying to rationalize the things I saw, even as they became harder and harder to ignore. One of the worst experiences happened when I was very young. Before Caroline had moved out, I was sitting in my parents' bedroom, playing with a few small toys. The closet door was open, a dark void in the otherwise well-lit room. I remember the moment vividly. I glanced up and saw something moving. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it moved again. A shape, indistinct but undeniably there, began to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't a person, not really. It was more of a presence. But it had form. I couldn't describe it then. And even now, the memory of it makes my skin crawl. All I knew was that it was watching me. I screamed and ran from the room. My parents barely reacted. "Just a bad dream," they said, but it wasn't a dream. I was wide awake, and something had been there. As I got older, the experiences only intensified. I never saw the entity directly, but I always knew when it was near. A shadow would stretch unnaturally long across the floor. A cold chill would creep up my spine, even in the height of summer. Objects would shift ever so slightly when I wasn't looking, only for me to find them in places they had no reason to be. Then, in 8th grade, everything changed. That was the first time I saw him. The spirit, the presence I had felt for years finally revealed itself. I had just gotten into bed when the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in misty puffs, my skin prickling with cold. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a physical force. And then, at the foot of my bed, a shadow took form. He wasn't fully solid, more like a figure made of darkness, shifting and flickering like a flame. But I could see the outline of a man. His features were indistinct, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I could barely breathe. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. The room warmed instantly, and I was left gasping for air, drenched in sweat despite the cold. From that night on, he never left me alone. I named him Daniel. It was a joke at first, like I was Tom from Tom and Jerry, and he was the ghost I was constantly trying to escape. But the more I saw him, the less funny it became. Daniel's shadow would appear in the guest room, stretching long against the floor even when no one was inside. I'd hear footsteps in the basement, where no one ever went. I'd feel him watching me from the darkness of my closet. I still don't know who, or what, Daniel was. A lost soul? A malevolent presence? Something even worse? I have no answers, only theories. One theory. Daniel was a ghostly victim of something far more sinister that lurked in that house. And he clung to me for protection. Another theory. I was cursed from the start. A third theory. I had an overactive imagination. I doubt it was the third one. Because even now, years later, I still feel him watching me. And every now and then, I see his shadow stretching along the floor. Just like it always did back in that house. Story 3. It was a morning like any other. The sun was barely peeking through the curtains, and the dim light cast long shadows across my room. I was groggily pulling my school uniform over my head, rubbing my eyes to shake off the last remnants of sleep. The air was thick with the usual sounds of the morning, birds chirping outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the muffled voices of my family going about their routines. Everything seemed normal. Then, as I reached for the remote to turn on the television, I heard it, a voice, small and trembling, echoing from somewhere in the room. "Where is my mother?" The voice belonged to a little girl, no older than 6 or 7. It was soft but clear, almost as if she were standing right behind me. A chill ran down my spine. My body froze. I turned my head ever so slightly, eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. My heart pounded against my ribs. The logical part of my brain tried to reason with me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of my half-awake mind. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. It was real. Panic gripped me. I bolted out of my room, leaving my little sister still asleep in her bed. My feet barely touched the floor as I ran into the kitchen, where my grandmother was making breakfast. I must have looked pale because she turned to me with a concerned expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. Did you hear that?" I stammered. She frowned. "Hear what?" "A voice. A little girl." She asked where her mother was. Grandma pursed her lips and gave me a knowing look. "There's nothing there, sweetheart. Maybe you're just tired." I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me otherwise. I swallowed hard and nodded, forcing myself to shake off the fear. If my grandmother wasn't worried, then maybe I shouldn't be either. But the fear didn't leave me. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind, whispering that something wasn't right. That afternoon at school, I had almost convinced myself that the morning's events had been nothing more than my imagination. Almost. It was lunchtime, and I was standing in line at the cafeteria, chatting with my friends. The line moved forward slowly, and I barely paid attention as I waited for my turn at the register. Then it happened again. A sudden tug at my ear. Not a light brush or a casual bump from another student, but a firm, deliberate pull, as if someone was trying to get my attention. "Come on," a voice whispered, urgent and impatient. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same voice. The same little girl. I whipped around, expecting to see a classmate standing behind me. But there was no one. The students behind me were talking amongst themselves, oblivious. The cashier was still several feet away, waiting for the next person to step forward. The world around me suddenly felt unreal. The sounds of the cafeteria became distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. My skin prickled with cold. The realization struck me like a blow to the chest. This wasn't my imagination. Someone, was following me. The days that followed were filled with unease. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Always listening, always watching. Shadows stretched a little too long in the corners of my vision. Whispers curled around me in the silence. And that feeling, that terrible, unshakable feeling of being watched, never left. Then, one evening, as I lay in bed with my blankets pulled up to my chin, I heard it again. "Where is my mother?" This time, the voice was closer, right beside my ear. A cold breath tickled my skin. My heart stopped. I snapped my head toward the source. But my room was dark. My eyes adjusted slowly. A figure stood in the corner. Barely visible. A silhouette darker than the surrounding shadows. The shape of a small child. Unmoving. Staring. I wanted to scream. To call for help. But my voice was stuck in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on my nightstand. The moment the light flickered on, the shadow was gone. I barely slept that night. And for weeks after, I avoided being alone, keeping the lights on as long as I could. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was over, I knew deep down, it wasn't. One afternoon, I was home alone, sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. The house was quiet, unnaturally so. I was about to get up for a drink when I heard it again. "Come on." The whisper was right behind me. I spun around, and for the briefest moment, I saw her, a pale face, eyes hollow and dark, staring at me from the reflection of the TV screen. My blood ran cold. By the time I blinked, she was gone. That was the last time I ever heard her voice. But even now, years later, I still feel her presence sometimes, lurking just at the edge of my vision, waiting. Looking back, I often wonder about the little girl's voice. Was she truly a lost spirit, desperately searching for her mother? Or was she something else, something darker? Something beyond my understanding? Whatever the case, the experience left a permanent mark on me. It made me question the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknown. Some people believe that spirits linger in places where they have unfinished business. Others think they attach themselves to those who can hear them, who can sense them. Maybe, for a brief moment in time, I became that person for her. And maybe, just maybe, she's still out there, whispering in the dark, waiting for someone to listen. Story 4. There are times when dreams feel more than just figments of our imagination. They press against reality, whispering things we don't quite understand until the truth unfolds before our very eyes. This is one such story, where a dream was more than just a vision, it was a warning. About 2 weeks ago, I had a dream unlike any other. My husband, our daughter, and I had apparently purchased a house. A grand, old house with tall windows and an eerie presence about it. Strangely, we weren't looking to buy a home. Yet in this dream, we were settling into a place that wasn't ours. I stood on the back patio, speaking with an old woman. She looked frail, her gray hair tied back loosely, and she had an air of timelessness about her. I knew, somehow, that she wasn't alive, she was a spirit. But she wasn't hostile, in fact, she seemed kind. However, when I mentioned that we were moving in, her demeanor changed. She became rigid, her face twisting in silent anger. Then, she vanished. The air turned thick, suffocating, and suddenly, Objects began flying across the patio. The anger in the house was palpable. And at that moment, I knew we weren't welcome. A Christmas tree, of all things, came hurling towards my daughter. I screamed, but before I could react, the doorbell rang. Startled, I ran to the door. Standing outside were 3 men. Their expressions unreadable. One of them held my phone and keys in his outstretched hand. "Where did you get my phone?" I asked hesitantly. "Down the block," one of them replied. My heart pounded. I knew I had left it on the patio. Yet here it was, retrieved from somewhere far beyond where I had been. My hands trembled as I pressed the picture button, and what appeared on the screen sent a chill down my spine. It was her, the old woman. Her face, ghastly and filled with unspoken rage, stared back at me through the cracked screen. My breath caught in my throat. The dream shattered, and I woke up drenched in sweat. The next night, I dreamed again. This time, we had moved into the house, and in one of the bedrooms, I could feel something lurking. It was unseen, but its presence was undeniable. The moment I stepped into the room, it pushed me back with an invisible force. My body seized in terror. And then, just like the night before, I jolted awake. Gasping for breath, 2 days later, my husband received a call. He had been secretly trying to surprise me by getting a mortgage for a new home. I froze, my pulse quickening. Could this really be happening? The connection between my dreams and reality sent shivers down my spine. Despite my unease, I accompanied him to view homes. I had always adored the historic districts. With their Victorian architecture and rich history, we toured countless houses, but none felt right. Then, one day, while searching alone, I took a wrong turn and found myself on an unfamiliar street. As I slowed at a speed bump, something caught my eye. On the right side of the road, an elderly woman sat in the middle of an empty, damp lot, petting a stray cat. My first thought was one of pity. Was she homeless? But something about her was unsettling. To my left stood a breathtaking but derelict Victorian house, its faded pink facade contrasting starkly with its air of abandonment. The place was mesmerizing. Without thinking, I pulled over and climbed the locked gate. I had to see it up close. Walking down the side of the house, I noticed the familiar layout, the pine trees, the brick pathway. My chest tightened. This was the house from my dream. A sickening feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, reassuring myself that it was just an odd coincidence. But as I reached the side door, dread washed over me. It was an inexplicable, consuming fear that made my skin crawl. My instincts screamed at me to leave. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the empty air. "I was just admiring you. I'll go now." I turned on my heel and fled, my heart hammering. Across the street, 3 men stood watching me. "Do you know anything about this house?" I asked, breathless. One of them shrugged. "Been empty for over 20 years. Old man comes by sometimes, just to hang a 'keep out' sign." A chill ran down my spine. I wrote a letter, explaining my interest in the house, my strange dreams, and the feeling that overwhelmed me. I left it in the mailbox, hoping for a response. That evening, I told my mother about what had happened. Her reaction was immediate and firm. "Stay away from that house." Despite her warning, curiosity got the better of me. I returned the next day with my daughter to take pictures. When I uploaded them to my computer, my blood ran cold. There, in the second-floor window, was the unmistakable silhouette of a woman. That night, sleep did not come easy. When I finally drifted off, I found myself back in the pink Victorian house. I kept tripping over the same old woman, her long gray hair covering her face. Each time, she muttered the same phrase. Again. Next week, I woke with a start. The words echoed in my mind. What was going to happen next week? There are things in this world we cannot explain. Forces that seem to reach out through the veil of reality to touch our lives in ways that feel all too real. Was the house trying to communicate with me? Was the spirit warning me or seeking something from me? Some would say it was mere coincidence. But the pieces fit together too perfectly. A dream, a house, an old woman. Threads woven together by an unseen hand. I never returned to that place. And perhaps it was for the best. Yet even now, the thought lingers in my mind. What if I had stayed? What if I had ignored the warning? And more importantly, what was waiting for me the following week? Story 5. There are things in this world that defy logic. Some say spirits linger, bound to the places and people they once loved. Others dismiss such tales as mere superstition. But what if I told you that some of us, whether we like it or not, can see them? Speak to them, even befriend them? This is not a ghost story meant to scare you. This is my reality. A reality where my best friend has been dead for years. Yet he never truly left. My name is not Michael. But for the sake of this story, let's call me that. I had a best friend once. His name was John. The thing is, most people's best friends are alive. John is not. John died when he was just 4 years old. A car explosion took him and his mother away, leaving only his father behind. They say the car malfunctioned. The gas tank ignited. One moment, they were a happy family driving down the road. And the next, they were engulfed in flames. I never knew him when he was alive. But one day, he just appeared in my room as if he had always been there. I was 5 years old when I first saw John. My parents had always said I talked to things they couldn't see. But John was different. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the corner of my vision. Nor was he a fleeting whisper in the dark. He was real, at least. To me. At first, I didn't realize John was dead. He looked like any other kid, messy brown hair, wide blue eyes filled with curiosity. He'd sit on my bed, cross-legged, his small fingers tugging at the edge of his shirt while we talked. "What do you want to play?" I remember asking him one day. He tilted his head. "I don't know. I just like being here." It wasn't until I told my mom about my new friend that things got strange. "John?" She froze, her hand gripping the kitchen counter. "Michael. Where did you hear that name?" "He told me," I said simply. "He comes to my room every night." Her face turned pale, and she exchanged a look with my dad. That night, I overheard them whispering. My mother said something about the gift running in our family. About how she used to see things too but had learned to ignore them. But how do you ignore someone who talks to you every day? By the time I reached 7th grade, John was still with me. He never aged, never changed. It had become a part of my life, this strange, unspoken reality where I lived between two worlds. Then came the demons. I don't know what else to call them. Shadows with twisted faces, crawling on my bedroom walls, whispering things I couldn't understand. They never spoke like John did. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to fill the room with a suffocating dread. I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't leave. They clawed at the edges of my dreams. their cold fingers brushing against my skin when I was alone. John warned me about them. They don't like you seeing us, he said one night, sitting on my windowsill. They want you to be like everyone else. I told a kid in my class about John. I shouldn't have. The next day, everyone was calling me crazy. They laughed, made jokes, whispered behind my back. Michael talks to ghosts. Maybe he's possessed. I tried to shut it out, to pretend it didn't bother me. But the truth was, it did. I started keeping John a secret after that. Only one person didn't laugh. Her name was Allie. She wasn't like the other girls. She wasn't overly cheerful or full of gossip. She was just nice. One day, she sat beside me on the bus and said, "I don't think you're crazy." I looked at her, skeptical. Why? She shrugged. Because I've seen things too. That was the first time I realized I wasn't alone. The ability to see the dead, some might call it a curse. My mother had it, and before her, my grandmother. They all learned to suppress it, to push it away. But I couldn't. John wouldn't let me. As I grew older, I began to understand the rules. Some spirits were lost, wandering, unaware they had even passed. Others, like John, had a purpose, a reason to stay. And then there were the ones that weren't human at all. Things that thrived on fear, darkness, and confusion. One night, I woke up to find John standing by my bed, staring at the door. His expression was unreadable. "They're coming," he whispered. The air felt thick, suffocating. A shadow stretched from the hallway, creeping into my room. The air smelled like sulfur, heavy and oppressive. My skin prickled as whispers slithered through the darkness. I closed my eyes, heart pounding. My mother had once told me not to acknowledge them. That fear was their invitation. But how do you ignore something standing at the foot of your bed? Watching? Even now, John is still with me. Watching, listening. "Say hi for me," John whispers. I smile. John says hi. Most people wouldn't believe me. And that's okay. Because whether you believe or not, some things are still real. Some stories are meant to be told. Others, to be kept in the shadows, whispered between those who understand. I don't expect you to believe me. But if you ever find yourself alone in your room, feeling like someone is watching, maybe, just maybe, you're not alone either. Story 6. There are stories that cling to the walls of a home, whispering through the cracks, lingering in the air like a sorrowful melody that refuses to fade. Some say that emotions, especially the most intense ones, grief, love, and despair, can imprint themselves onto a place, becoming something more than memory. This story, one of loss, longing, and the inexplicable, is one such tale. A few years ago, Evelyn Carter's life shattered in a moment. It was a snowy Christmas Eve, the kind that looked like something out of a greeting card, twinkling lights, fresh powder coating the sidewalks, and the muffled hush of winter settling over the small New England town of Ashford Hollow. Evelyn had been waiting for her husband, Daniel, to return home from work. She was heavily pregnant with their first child, the excitement of their growing family making the holiday season even more special. But then, the knock came. The police officer at the door carried a sorrow in his expression that said everything before he even uttered a word. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said gently. "Your husband, there was an accident." She didn't remember much after that. The words blurred, lost beneath the tidal wave of grief that consumed her. They told her it had been instant, that he hadn't suffered. But what about her? What about the suffering she endured from that moment forward? For years, Evelyn was trapped in a cycle of mourning. She wandered through their home at night, pacing from room to room, clutching her growing stomach, crying silently as she leaned against the kitchen sink. The loneliness was unbearable, the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders like a cold, relentless presence. Even after her child was born, the sorrow didn't lift, it lingered, shadowing every holiday season with an emptiness no decorations or carols could fill. She tried everything: counseling, support groups, even throwing herself into work, but nothing seemed to shake the ghost of her grief. It remained like an invisible chain around her heart, pulling her back to those cold, silent nights where only the sound of her own sobs filled the empty house. Eventually, she couldn't stay. The house held too many ghosts, not in the literal sense. Not yet, but the memories were suffocating. So she sold it, hoping a new start would allow her to heal. The new house was quaint, located just a few miles away in a quiet neighborhood. She settled in, trying to create a home that felt like hers rather than a monument to loss. Time passed, and life continued its slow, uneven march forward. And then, one afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. "I met the new owners of your old place," the woman mentioned casually as they sipped tea in Evelyn's living room. "Lovely people, but, well, they said something strange." Evelyn lifted her eyes. "Strange?" The neighbor hesitated, then leaned in as if sharing a secret. "They think it's haunted." Evelyn's breath caught. "What?" "They say every Christmas season, they see a woman, a pregnant woman. She walks through the house at night, crying, mostly around the kitchen. And the wife," the neighbor lowered her voice further, "she says she feels pains in her stomach whenever she's in there." The words sank into Evelyn like a stone dropping into deep water. She could almost hear the echoes of her own footsteps pacing the floors, her own sobs breaking the silence of those lonely nights. Had her grief truly left such a mark that it remained, playing on an endless loop for those who came after? She had never believed in ghosts. Not in the traditional sense. But this, Evelyn's mind wandered back to the day she left the house for the last time. She had walked through each room, running her fingers along the walls, whispering a silent goodbye. Had something of her still remained? A part of her sorrow so deeply embedded in those walls that it had taken on a life of its own? Maybe some emotions never leave. Maybe, when sorrow is strong enough, it seeps into the very foundation of a place, like ink spilled on paper, impossible to erase. Evelyn never returned to the house. She didn't want to, but every Christmas, when the night grew still and the snow fell softly outside her window, she couldn't help but wonder, was there still a shadow of her former self, trapped in that house, grieving for a love lost to time? And if so, would she ever truly be free of it? Grief is a powerful force. Some believe that the weight of sorrow, especially when tied to tragedy, can linger long after a person has moved on. This story is one of many where the past refuses to stay buried, where the echoes of heartbreak manifest in ways we may never fully understand. Was it a spirit, or was it merely the residual energy of an unbearable loss, replaying like a broken record? Perhaps, in the end, some imprints of the soul never truly fade. Story 7. There are tales that lurk at the edge of our perception. Stories whispered in hushed tones. Experiences dismissed as figments of imagination. But what if they are real? What if the things that haunt our dreams spill into the waking world? Tonight, I will share with you a story that has remained unspoken for years. A tale of something dark, something relentless, and something that does not simply vanish with the light of dawn. I never spoke about this to anyone, except for one other soul. For the longest time, I convinced myself that my experiences were nothing more than sleep paralysis, a known phenomenon where one wakes up unable to move, often accompanied by unsettling visions or sensations. I wanted to believe that explanation, truly, but the circumstances surrounding my encounters made it impossible to dismiss as just another trick of the mind. These incidents only occurred when I was at my parents' house, never anywhere else. I could go months or even years without experiencing them while living elsewhere. But as soon as I returned home, the darkness returned too. It would begin the same way every time. I would wake up in my bed, frozen, unable to move a single muscle except for my eyes. A crushing weight pressed down on my chest, making it feel as though I were sinking into the mattress. But there was nothing visible, just an all-consuming blackness. It was not merely a shadow but something deeper, something tangible. And then, it would speak, a voice, grim, raspy, whispering the same chilling words over and over. I tried to scream, to move, to escape, but I was utterly powerless. No sound would come out. My mind screamed even as my body lay trapped in a state of helpless paralysis. For a long time, I told myself that this was just a recurring nightmare, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that if I ignored it, it would eventually stop. But everything changed when my cousin came to stay with us. He had never experienced anything like it before, but within days of arriving, he confided in me that he had been waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling something choking him. At first, he did not want to believe it, but after it happened 3 nights in a row, he finally asked me, out of the blue, if I believed in ghosts. I hesitated, and then, for the first time, I told someone about my experiences. As I spoke, I realized something even more unsettling, since my cousin had arrived. The entity had stopped coming for me. Instead, it had turned its attention to him. He described, in perfect detail, the same eerie presence, the same oppressive weight, the same chilling voice that had tormented me for years. Even the words it whispered to him were nearly identical. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. Was this thing truly attached to my parents' house? Or worse, was it attached to me? We decided that we needed to do something. We sat in my room, discussing possible ways to rid ourselves of this entity. That's when the atmosphere in the room shifted. A sudden, biting cold filled the air, not throughout the entire space, but concentrated in one particular corner. My cousin stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the far side of the room. Then, the noise came, a growling, unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't animalistic, nor was it human. It was a wail, a high-pitched, agonized sound that sent every hair on my body standing on end. It circled us, moving around the room like an invisible predator. Shifting toward the door, my cousin and I exchanged a look of pure terror. And then, the door slammed shut, not gently, not as though a breeze had caught it. It was wide open 1 second, and in the next, it slammed with such force that the walls shook. Silence followed. We sat there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. But there was nothing. Just the suffocating quiet of a house that suddenly felt much emptier than before. The following nights, I could not sleep. The house felt different. like something had been disturbed. My cousin left soon after, unable to shake the feeling of unease. And yet, I remained, too stubborn or perhaps too scared to acknowledge that something was truly wrong. One night, weeks later, I awoke again. The same paralysis gripped my body. But this time, there was no voice, only silence. Then, in the darkness, I saw it, a shape, a deeper blackness standing at the foot of my bed, watching. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. It did not move, it did not speak, it simply stood there, an unwelcome presence in my room. After what felt like an eternity, the weight lifted, my body became my own again. And when I sat up, the figure was gone. I turned on every light in the room and did not sleep again until dawn. Since that day, I have never spoken of it. My cousin and I rarely bring it up. Whatever it was, it left, at least. For now. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the same sensation. The same creeping dread that something is just beyond my vision. Waiting. I wonder if it will ever return. Stories like these often fall into the realm of the unexplainable. Was it truly a supernatural entity? Or just a deeply ingrained fear manifesting itself in physical ways? Many would argue the latter. But when two people experience the exact same horror, down to the last whispered word, the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Perhaps we will never know the truth. But one thing is certain. There are things in this world that defy logic. Things that linger in the dark corners of our lives, waiting for the right moment to speak once more. Story 8. There are moments in life when we are confronted with things beyond reason, beyond science, when the unseen makes itself known in the most unexpected ways. Some say spirits linger because they have unfinished business, while others believe they stay because of love. This is one such story, one that blurs the line between the living and the dead, proving that some bonds refuse to be broken, even by death itself. I had always considered myself a rational person, someone who believed in things I could see and touch. But in the winter of 2003, I experienced something that defied all explanation. It all began with my beloved cat, Midnight. Midnight was no ordinary cat, a sleek black feline with striking green eyes. He was my shadow, my confidant, my closest companion. I had rescued him as a kitten from an alleyway. And from that day forward, we had been inseparable. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. On December 23rd, Midnight fell gravely ill. His once agile body grew still. His playful energy drained away. He could barely move, save for the slight twitch of his tail. Desperate, I rushed him to the vet, where I received the devastating news. An aggressive form of cancer had taken hold of him. And there was nothing that could be done. The humane choice, they said, was to let him go. On Christmas Eve, with a heavy heart and tear-stained cheeks, I held Midnight in my arms as the vet administered the injection. His body grew limp, his breathing slowed, and then, nothing. He was gone. The house felt empty without him. I tried to immerse myself in the holiday spirit, but an unshakable sorrow loomed over me. Then, on Christmas night, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting alone in the sunroom, the dim glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. Absent-mindedly, I glanced toward the dining room when something caught my eye, a glimmer. A soft pulse of light. My heart clenched as I turned back. expecting it to be a trick of my tired mind. But it wasn't. A small, glowing orb hovered above the dining table, shimmering like a star lost in the dark. It moved with purpose, drifting through the air as though searching for something. I sat frozen, watching as it glided into the kitchen and vanished behind a corner. My breath hitched in my throat. Had I imagined it? The next night, at precisely 9:05 p.m., the orb returned. This time, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I sensed movement at the doorway. I turned my head and saw it, the same glowing sphere. It hovered just inside my room, pulsating gently before weaving through the air in a slow, deliberate dance. I felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of familiarity. Then, just as it had the night before, it drifted back downstairs and disappeared into the basement. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake, my mind racing, waiting for it to return. But it didn't, at least. Not that night. Weeks passed, and though the orb's visits became less frequent, midnight's presence never truly left. Some nights, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house, I would hear the soft sound of paws padding across the floor. I would turn, expecting to see my other cats, but they would be fast asleep. Other times, I would feel a light pressure at the foot of my bed, as though something unseen had curled up beside me. Then, one night, I saw him. I had been reading about paranormal encounters when I stumbled upon an article about ghost orbs. How some believe them to be the spirits of the departed. The moment I read that, my breath caught. Could it be? Was midnight trying to reach me? As if in response to my thoughts, movement drew my gaze to the doorway. My heart stopped. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was midnight. He was translucent, his form barely more than a whisper of what he once was. But his eyes, those familiar green eyes, locked onto mine. Filled with a silent understanding, he took a slow step forward, and then, as if a breeze had passed through, he faded into nothing. But I knew, in that moment, he was still with me. Even now, years later, I still sense him. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond my line of sight. Other times, I feel the gentle brush of something unseen against my leg, the way midnight used to rub against me for attention. I used to believe that death was the end, that once something was gone, it was gone forever. But now, I know better. Some souls refuse to leave. And love, true, unwavering love, never fades. Paranormal encounters are often met with skepticism. But those who have experienced them know the truth. Our loved ones never truly leave us. Whether as a whisper in the dark, a fleeting shadow, or a glowing orb in the night, they find ways to remind us that they are still watching over us. Perhaps midnight was never truly gone. Perhaps, in some way, he had become my guardian, watching from beyond the veil, making sure I never felt alone. Or maybe, just maybe, love is stronger than even death itself. And that is something truly magical. Story 9. I have always been drawn to the supernatural. But it was never something I actively sought out. It simply existed in the background of my life, lurking in the shadows of my childhood memories. Some people dismiss ghost stories as mere hallucinations or tricks of the mind. But when you have experienced things that defy all logic, you start to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the world is much stranger than we think. I remember one particular night from my childhood with absolute clarity. It was the night I first saw him, the man in the hallway. I was 5 years old at the time, living with my family in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet town. My grandfather also lived with us, occupying one of the rooms. My father worked long hours and often had to leave for work early in the morning. My mother, always diligent, would wake up before dawn to prepare his lunch. That night, my father had to leave even earlier than usual, at around 3 in the morning. I had been fast asleep until I was woken up by the sounds of my mother moving about in the kitchen. The clatter of pots and the gentle hum of her voice as she prepared food stirred me from my slumber. Still groggy, I wandered into the kitchen, rubbing my eyes. My mother turned to me with a surprised look. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked. "It's too early for you. Go back to bed. I want to help," I said stubbornly. She smiled and shook her head. "You can't help without shoes on. Just sit on the carpet and keep me company." I sat down near the kitchen entrance, watching her work. The warm glow of the kitchen light made the whole apartment feel safe. Cozy. I chatted with my mother, asking her about the food she was making. The smell of eggs and toast filled the air, making my stomach grumble. Then, suddenly, an eerie sensation washed over me. A strange, unexplainable feeling that someone was watching me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head towards the darkened living room. Everything beyond the kitchen light was swallowed in pitch-black shadows. My skin prickled as a cold rush of air ran through my body. I shook it off and turned back to my mother. But the feeling didn't go away. It was stronger now. I turned my head again, my eyes adjusting to the dimness of the room. At first, I saw nothing. But then, there, in the hallway that led to our bedrooms and the bathroom, a figure stood motionless in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, a tall, slender man. He wasn't just a shadow or a silhouette. I could see the details of his clothing, the shape of his jeans, the outline of a t-shirt. But everything about him was completely black. No face, no color, just darkness. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was imagining things. When I opened them again, he was still there. I didn't move. I couldn't. The man in the hallway just stood there, staring at me. Then, he began to kneel down, as if trying to meet my gaze. Even as he did, he remained shrouded in darkness, an ink-black void against the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. My mother, still focused on preparing my father's lunch, noticed my silence. "What's wrong, honey?" I pointed towards the hallway, my voice barely a whisper. "There's a man." She barely glanced up. "What are you talking about?" I swallowed hard. The shadowy figure was now motioning to me. He raised one arm and crooked his finger, beckoning me to come closer. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I could feel a grin forming on his faceless void. Even though I couldn't see it, I felt it. "Mama," I said, my voice shaking. "He wants me to come to him." At that, my mother finally looked up, her expression shifting to concern. "What? Who wants you to?" She turned her head towards the hallway. But when I looked back, he was gone. She sighed, clearly thinking I was imagining things. Still, she flipped on the hallway light and walked over. "There's nothing here," she said, checking the bedrooms. "Your brother is sleeping. Your father is changing. And your grandfather's door is locked. No one was in the hallway." She led me back to bed, whispering reassurances as she tucked me in beside her. I buried my face in the blankets, trying to shake off the feeling that the shadowy man was still there, watching from the darkness. For a while, I managed to forget about him, but he never truly left. I would continue to see shadowy figures moving in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers when no one else was around. I told no one. I was afraid they would dismiss it, call it childish imagination, so I kept it to myself. Now, at 24, I have long accepted that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I still see them, figures lurking in the dark, watching, waiting. Some nights, I wake up to find my bedroom door slightly open, though I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. Sometimes, I hear soft footsteps in the hall, stopping just outside my door, and every so often, when the moonlight casts just the right amount of glow into the shadows of my apartment, I catch a glimpse of him again, the man in the hallway, still watching, still waiting. There are countless stories of shadow figures, mysterious presences that seem to exist just beyond the veil of human perception. Some believe they're lost souls, wandering spirits trapped between this world and the next. Others claim they are something far more sinister, beings that do not belong to our world, but slip through the cracks when the conditions are just right. Was the man in the hallway a mere trick of the mind? A shadow cast by the flickering lights of a childhood memory? Or was he something else entirely? Something real, something that never truly left. Some say that once you see them, they never really go away. They just wait, patiently, for the next time you decide to look into the darkness. Story 10. Some places carry a presence, an energy, that lingers long after their inhabitants have departed. There are buildings with histories so layered, so soaked in sorrow and mystery, that even time itself cannot erase the echoes of the past. One such place is the infamous Coldwater Manor, a sprawling mansion with an unsettling reputation. Many have whispered about the restless spirits that roam its halls, but few have dared to venture deep enough to truly experience them. What you are about to hear is a first-hand account from someone who did. It was in March of 2006 when I decided to take the behind-the-scenes tour of Coldwater Manor. The estate, once belonging to an eccentric and reclusive woman named Eleanor Whitmore, had stood for over a century, with rumors swirling about hidden rooms, lost spirits, and unexplained occurrences. The tour promised an exclusive look at the more secretive areas of the mansion, including the dimly lit, foreboding basement. Our group consisted of about 10 people, all eager yet cautious as we descended into the cold underbelly of the manor. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old coal. The guide led us through narrow passageways lined with aging brick walls, their surfaces scarred by time. In one corner of the basement, the remains of an old coal bin sat, its wooden frame splintered with age. I positioned myself at the back of the group, my backpack secured snugly against my shoulders, hands resting on my hips as I listened to the guide recount the history of the house. The room was eerily quiet, save for the distant dripping of water somewhere beyond our sight. Shadows danced across the walls as our guide moved the flashlight around, illuminating the crumbling stonework and rusted pipes lining the ceiling. Then, it happened. A sudden, sharp chill ran down my spine as I felt two icy fingers tap against my arm. It wasn't a soft touch, it was deliberate, assertive. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, a firm but controlled nudge pressed against my backpack. It was as if someone, unseen yet impatient, was trying to move me aside. The sensation was strong enough that I actually had to take a step forward to regain my balance. I spun around, expecting to see one of my fellow tourists standing too close. But there was no one behind me. Just the cold, unyielding stone walls of the basement. For a moment, I stood there, rubbing my arm where the icy fingers had touched me, trying to chase away the lingering cold. I shook it off, convinced that it was just my imagination or a trick of the mind. But then, it happened again. This time, the force was stronger, the push more insistent. The air around me felt different, charged with something unseen, something not of this world. A deep unease settled in my stomach as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone down there. Instinct took over, and I moved to another spot in the room, away from the coal bin. Whatever had been near me did not follow. But the heavy silence in that basement felt loaded with unseen eyes watching my every move. I glanced over at my fellow tourists, but they seemed oblivious to what had just happened. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim glow of the flashlight beam, a faint mist began to swirl in the far corner of the basement. At first, I thought it was just dust disturbed by our movement. But as I watched, it coalesced into a vague, human-like shape. It lingered for only a few moments before dissolving into nothingness. I felt my chest tighten as an overwhelming sense of unease gripped me. After the tour ended, I pulled the guide aside and told her about my experience. I expected skepticism, maybe even a dismissive chuckle. Instead, she gave me a knowing look and nodded slowly. "You're not the first," she said. "Several guides have reported seeing an apparition in that very spot, a shadowy figure dressed in old workers' clothes. He never speaks, never shows his face clearly. But he's always there, in the basement." She went on to explain that many visitors had reported similar experiences. Unexplained cold spots, sudden touches, and even whispers in the darkness when no one else was around. Some had even claimed to hear the faint sound of shovels scraping against stone, as if someone, something, was still working in the abandoned basement. A shiver ran through me as I processed her words. I hadn't seen him, but I felt him, and that, in a way, was even more terrifying. Some hauntings are loud, doors slamming, whispers in the dark, objects moving on their own. Others, like the spirit in Coldwater Manor, are subtle yet undeniable. To this day, I still remember the sensation of those cold fingers, the insistent push against my backpack, and the inexplicable sense that I was standing in someone's way. Someone long gone but still lingering. If you've ever felt like you weren't alone in an empty room. If you've ever sensed eyes on you when no one was there. Perhaps you, too, have brushed against something beyond this world. Maybe some spirits stay behind not to haunt, but simply because they do not realize they've left the world of the living. Or perhaps, like the ghost in the basement, they have unfinished business, an endless task they were never able to complete. Do you believe in ghosts? After that day, I know I do. Thank you for joining me on this eerie journey into Coldwater Manor. If you have had a similar experience, I'd love to hear your story. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more chilling encounters. Until next time, stay curious. Stay cautious, and remember, sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried.